July 19, 1978, 2:45 p.m. National Archives, College Park, Maryland. The air, thick with the scent of aging paper and binding glue, hung still in the silent research room. Dr. Alistair Finch, a naval historian with a penchant for declassified ordnance reports, carefully untied the faded red ribbon on a file box labeled OSRD Document 88T45. His fingers, stained with ink from his morning's work, gently lifted the cover. Inside lay the, quote, final report on the Proximity Fuze development program, a document kept under lock and key for over 30 years. For decades, the story of the Pacific War's end seemed settled. Finch was about to learn that history had been missing its most decisive chapter. The story didn't start in the archives, of course. It began in the sterile, fluorescent-lit offices of Washington, D.C. in August 1940, a full 16 months before Pearl Harbor. Dr. Vannevar Bush, director of the OSRD and a man whose sharp suits and sharper intellect intimidated generals, saw the storm coming. A dual Ph.D. from Harvard and MIT, Bush understood that the next war wouldn't be won with brute force alone. He summoned Dr. Merle A. Tuve, a brilliant, restless physicist from the Carnegie Institution, to his office. Tuve, a man who couldn't sit still and was known for pacing relentlessly while solving problems, was given an impossible task by Bush: lead a new Section T and invent a weapon so advanced it bordered on science fiction. He needed a brain small enough to fit in a 5-inch artillery shell, rugged enough to survive being fired from a cannon, and smart enough to hunt its own targets. This desperate need arose from a terrifying reality. In the early 1940s, anti-aircraft gunnery was a grim mathematical lottery with terrible odds. To shoot down a fast-moving enemy plane, gunners had to achieve a direct hit or set a mechanical time fuse to explode at the precise moment the shell intercepted the aircraft's path, a near-impossible calculation involving speed, altitude, and distance. The failure rate was over 99.5%. Rear Admiral William H.P. Spike Blandy, the cigar-chewing chief of the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance and a 1913 Naval Academy graduate, knew these numbers meant dead sailors and sunken ships. He needed a miracle. Tuve's team of 400 scientists, crammed into a converted garage at 8621 Georgia Avenue, Silver Spring, Maryland, began their work amidst the smell of hot vacuum tubes and burnt coffee, tasked with creating a fuzz that could withstand 20,000 gigaseconds of acceleration, a force that would flatten any conventional electronics. They were building Blandy's miracle. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japanese naval strategists like Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto looked at the American fleet with analytical contempt. They saw the fast, modern carriers as the primary threat, but dismissed the older battleships, relics like the U.S. Pennsylvania, BB-38, and the U.S. Tennessee, BB-43, as obsolete. These lumbering dreadnoughts, survivors of Pearl Harbor, were too slow to keep up with the carrier task forces. In Japanese war games and intelligence reports from late 1943, they were classified as second-rate assets, useful only for softening up beaches. Their thick armor and big guns meant nothing against modern aircraft. This colossal underestimation, this failure to see past the steel plate and notice the strange new antennas sprouting from their masts, would become one of the costliest intelligence failures in military history. The Japanese saw slow targets. They didn't see the integrated killing machine being born. An invisible network connecting advanced SK-2 radar, a 100-pound analog fire control computer, and a shell that had its own brain. This system, codenamed Project A, would turn those old battleships into the most lethal anti-aircraft platforms the world had ever seen. Before I tell you how Dr. Vannevar Bush and his team at Section T managed to create an invisible shield of steel around the U.S. fleet, comment here where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the story of the thinking shell that made the Kamikaze obsolete. The Pacific Theater, in the smoldering aftermath of December 7, 1941, was a vast ocean of American vulnerability. The attack on Pearl Harbor by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Kido Butai, executed with 353 aircraft, hadn't just sunk battleships, it had shattered the illusion of safety. On the decks of surviving ships like the USS Nevada, BB-36, the air still tasted of acrid smoke and defeat. U.S. anti-aircraft gunnery, relying on visually aimed 3-inch guns and rudimentary directors, had proven tragically inadequate. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel's fleet was a testament to a brutal lesson. The sky now belonged to the enemy. Paragraph 115th Impact. Across that same ocean, confidence reigned aboard the battleship Nagato, flagship of the combined fleet. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a calculating strategist who had studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921, respected American industrial power but believed its spirit was brittle. His top air commander, Minoru Genda, planned the next phase with surgical precision, leveraging the superior agility of the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, which boasted a climb rate of 100 feet per minute. Their intelligence reports, filed in late 1942, correctly identified the U.S. carriers as the primary threat, but dismissed the surviving battleships as slow-moving targets, useful only for shelling beaches. This assessment, made by strategists like Commander Sadatoshi Tomioka, would prove a catastrophic failure of imagination. Paragraph 215's development. The grim truth was, the Japanese weren't entirely wrong. On a ship like the USS North Carolina, BB-55, in early 1942, the anti-aircraft defense was a frantic, human-powered affair. Her 10 twin-mount 5-inch/38 caliber guns were formidable, capable of hurling a 55-pound shell over 18,000 yards. But hitting a diving Aichi D-3 Aval bomber was another matter. The process involved the Mark 37 gunfire control system, a complex web of men and machines. Lookouts screamed bearings into sound-powered telephones, data was fed into the Ford Mark I fire control computer, and in the gun tubs, crews wrestled the heavy shells into the breaches amidst the deafening roar and the thick, sulphurous stench of burnt cordite. As Admiral Ernest J. King, the notoriously demanding Chief of Naval Operations, reviewed the after-action reports from early engagements, he saw a system that produced more noise and smoke than downed planes. Paragraph 315's expansion. The Battle of the Coral Sea, fought from May 4 to May 8, 1942, drove the point home with the force of a Japanese torpedo. It was the first naval battle fought entirely by air power, and for the U.S. Navy, it was a brutal education. The loss of the massive aircraft carrier USS Lexington, CV-2, which sank with 216 of her crew after being hit by 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs, was a devastating blow. The screening cruisers and destroyers, despite firing thousands of rounds, couldn't stop the determined pilots of the Japanese 5th Carrier Division. Paragraph 415's Impact. Far from the Pacific's warm waters, in a converted garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, the war was being fought with slide rules and soldering irons. Dr. Merle A. Tuve, a man whose physical restlessness mirrored his intellectual energy, drove his team at Section T with relentless urgency. The lab at 8621 Georgia Avenue was a chaotic symphony of humming transformers and the sharp crackle of overloaded circuits. By June 1942, the team, which included a young, brilliant physicist named Dr. James Van Allen, was fixated on the central, seemingly impossible problem, designing a vacuum tube, no bigger than a man's thumb, that could survive the 20,000 G-force of being fired from a cannon. The floor was littered with the shattered glass of failed prototypes. Paragraph 515's development. This frantic scientific effort was championed and funded by Rear Admiral William H.P. Spike Blandy, the Navy's straight-talking Chief of the Bureau of Ordnance. A 1913 Naval Academy graduate, Blandy was a gunnery man to his core, a pragmatist who chewed on cigars and dealt in results, not theories. He understood what men like Dr. Vannevar Bush were proposing was a sea change in warfare. Blandy's real genius was logistical. He orchestrated the immense, compartmentalized production network for Project A. He coordinated the efforts of 87 separate contractors, from Sylvania Electric Products, making the ruggedized 6L6 vacuum tubes, to Crosley Corporation assembling the delicate oscillator circuits. None of these companies knew the final purpose of the components, a masterful piece of industrial secrecy that began in earnest after the project's formal authorization on August 17, 1940. Paragraph 6/15 expansion. The strategic tide turned at the Battle of Midway between June 4 and June 7, 1942. It was a spectacular American victory, sinking 4 of Nagumo's best carriers. Yet, it also reinforced the fleet's vulnerability. The USS Yorktown, CV-5, crippled by 3 bomb hits from dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Michio Kobayashi, was a sitting duck. Despite a heroic defense, she was finished off by torpedoes 2 days later. The lesson was clear. Even a victorious fleet needed a better shield, an impenetrable defense for its most valuable assets. The pressure on Tuve and Blandy intensified. Paragraph 7/15 impact. The answer wasn't just in the shell, but in the system that aimed it. Parallel to Section T's work, an engineer at Bell Telephone Laboratories named Dr. David B. Parkinson was perfecting the Army's M9 gun director. This electrical analog computer was a marvel, capable of tracking a Luftwaffe bomber and predicting its future position with uncanny accuracy. The Navy, working with Ford Instrument Company, adapted these principles for their own Mark I fire control computer. This 100-pound mechanical brain, with its more than 20,000 intricate gears and servo motors, was the humming, thinking heart of the entire defensive system, a machine that made intuition obsolete and replaced it with cold, hard calculation. Paragraph 8/15 development. This new brain required a new nervous system. Starting in late 1943, the surviving battleships of Pearl Harbor were cycled through yards like the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington. The USA Tennessee, BB-43, her old cage masts torn away, sat in dry dock amidst a cacophony of riveting hammers and the hiss of acetylene torches. Workers swarmed over her, installing the new SK-2 air search radar, a powerful system operating at 700 megahertz that could spot a flight of bombers 100 miles out. They ran thousands of feet of new electrical cable, connecting the radar plot in the CIC to the new Mark 37 directors and the analog Mark I computer, which was carefully lowered deep into the ship's armored citadel. Captain Charles D. Wheelock, the yard's commanding officer, oversaw the transformation of these 32,000-ton behemoths from surface brawlers into sophisticated anti-aircraft platforms. Paragraph 9/15 expansion. The strategic necessity for this transformation was cemented at the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943. The brutal, 76-hour fight for a tiny atoll demonstrated the future of the Pacific War, amphibious assaults against heavily fortified islands. These operations required ships to linger offshore for days, vulnerable to air attack. The Marines, under Major General Julian C. Smith, needed absolute air superiority to survive on the beach, and the old battleships with their massive batteries of guns were the only assets that could provide that kind of sustained, defensive firepower. Paragraph 10/15 impact. By mid-1944, the Japanese military landscape had changed dramatically. Following the catastrophic loss of over 600 aircraft and 3 carriers at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots on June 19–20, 1944, Japan's conventional air power was broken. In this desperation, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed a radical new tactic, organized suicide attacks. The Kamikaze Special Attack Corps was born, with the first official sorties launched from airfields in the Philippines on October 25, 1944. The divine wind was about to be unleashed. Paragraph 11/15, Development. The kamikaze was more than a weapon. It was a psychological nightmare. A pilot, often with less than 100 hours of flight time, would take off in a Mitsubishi A6M0 or a Yokosuka D4Y Judy, stripped of all non-essential equipment and loaded with a single 550-pound bomb. His only mission was to crash his plane into an Allied ship. The terror these attacks induced was palpable. The whine of the diving engine, a sound that haunted sailors' dreams. On October 25, 1944, the escort carrier USS Street, low CVE-63, became their first major victim, sinking in just 30 minutes after a single kamikaze hit. Existing defenses which relied on putting up a wall of flak and hoping the pilot would lose his nerve were not enough to stop a man who had already accepted death. Paragraph 12/15, Expansion. But the solution was already in the pipeline. On January 15, 1943, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had issued a top-secret directive forbidding the use of the new fuse over land where a dud might be recovered. By early 1945, this restriction was about to be tested as millions of the Mark 32 VT fuzzed shells flowed to the fleet. The refitted battleships, now under the command of Vice Admiral Richmond K. Turner as part of Task Force 51, were ready. They weren't just armed with their 16 5-inch guns. They were now bristling with up to 40 40mm Bofors and 43 20mm Oerlikon cannons. Paragraph 13/15, Impact. Aboard the U.S. Maryland BB-46, the ship's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Joseph T. Hayward, a sharp 1935 Naval Academy graduate, felt the change. The endless drills weren't just about speed anymore. They were about system integration. In the ship's newly expanded Combat Information Center, the air was cool and smelled of ozone from the glowing radar scopes. Information flowed from the SK-2 radar to the plotting tables, then was transmitted electrically to his Mark 37 director and the whirring Mark I computer below decks. Hayward and his crew didn't know the secret of the shells they were about to fire, but they knew their new system could track and engage targets faster and farther than anything they'd ever imagined. Paragraph 14/15, Development. As March 1945 drew to a close, the largest amphibious force in history, over 300 ships, steamed towards Okinawa. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, the quiet, intellectual commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, knew that Imperial General Headquarters was preparing thousands of kamikaze aircraft to meet them. His trump card was the screen of 10 old battleships protecting Turner's vulnerable transports. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence analysts, like Captain Satatoshi Tomioka, were reviewing aerial reconnaissance photos. They saw the new radar antennas and the profusion of small-caliber guns, but dismissed them as minor upgrades. Their official reports, intercepted and decoded by the cryptanalysts at FRUPAC, continued to label the old battleships as secondary bombardment units, tactically obsolete. They had no idea they were about to attack not just ships, but a fully integrated, semi-autonomous killing machine. Paragraph 15/15, Expansion. The entire audacious project began in the stifling Washington, D.C., summer of August 1940, inside the wood-paneled office of Dr. Vannevar Bush, the OSRD director, a man whose piercing gaze seemed to dissect problems before they were even fully stated, handed a one-page directive to a perpetually restless Dr. Merle A. Tuve. The initial budget was a mere $1 million, a pittance for the miracle Bush was demanding. Tuve, a Johns Hopkins Ph.D. whose fingers constantly drummed on any available surface, was to create a thinking shell. The air, thick with the scent of Bush's pipe tobacco and stale coffee, carried the weight of an impossible assignment: build a brain for a bullet. Paragraph 1/10, Impact. Tuve immediately established Section T in a converted garage at 8621 Georgia Avenue, Silver Spring, Maryland, a location chosen for its academic anonymity. The central challenge, which consumed the first 18 months, was creating a vacuum tube that could survive the 20,000 G-force of being fired from a cannon. A young, brilliant physicist named Dr. James Van Allen led a team that worked 16-hour days, the lab echoing with the sharp, sickening pop of shattering glass as countless prototypes failed. They started with ruggedized Sylvania 6L6 radio tubes, but by late 1941, their success rate in centrifuge tests was a dismal 22%. The floor was a graveyard of electronic components, and the smell of burnt resin and ozone from overloaded circuits was the constant perfume of their frustration. Paragraph 2/10 Development. To maintain absolute secrecy, Rear Admiral William H.P. Spike Blandy, the cigar-chomping chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, devised a masterful system of industrial compartmentalization. He orchestrated a network of 87 separate contractors, including major firms like Crosley Corporation and RCA, to produce the Fuze's 130 individual components. No single company knew the final purpose of their work. The official cover story was that they were manufacturing parts for experimental radio weather stations. Blandy, a 1913 Naval Academy graduate who trusted numbers more than men, personally reviewed the production schedules, which would eventually account for over $1 billion in expenditures by 1945. He and Dr. Bush held weekly progress meetings over a SIG-SALY encrypted telephone line, two of the only men in the world who understood the full scope of what was being built in those scattered, anonymous factories. Paragraph 3/10 Expansion. The moment of truth arrived on August 12, 1942 at 11:15 a.m. in the humid, insect-filled air of a test site near Dahlgren, Virginia. A standard Navy 5-inch gun fired a shell loaded with the T-3 prototype Fuze. It streaked towards a radio-controlled drone aircraft. It didn't hit it. Instead, as it passed within the 70-foot kill radius, the fuse detonated perfectly. Dr. Merle Tuve and his exhausted team watched the drone erupt in a ball of flame. A ragged, spontaneous cheer broke the silence, mingling with the lingering, acrid smell of burnt cordite. The impossible had been done. Paragraph 4/10 Impact. With a working prototype, the challenge shifted from invention to mass production, a logistical nightmare that fell squarely on Admiral Blandy's shoulders. Working with Charles E. Wilson, the industrial titan from General Electric, Blandy oversaw the construction of 5 brand-new dedicated assembly plants by mid-1943. These facilities were designed to churn out an incredible 40,000 Fuzes per day. Inside, under the constant hum of conveyor belts and soldering stations, workers meticulously assembled the 130 components. The heart was the new, ruggedized T3 vacuum tube, a marvel of engineering developed by Dr. Richard B. Roberts' team, which now boasted a 98% survival rate when fired from a cannon. Paragraph 5/10 Development. In parallel, another piece of the puzzle was being perfected at Bell Telephone Laboratories in New Jersey. Dr. David B. Parkinson, a fastidious mechanical engineer with a degree from Case School of Applied Science, who was never seen without a starched white shirt and tie, was the lead inventor of the Army's M9 gun director. The Navy, working with Ford Instrument Company, adapted his principles to create the Ford Mark I fire control computer. This 100-pound mechanical brain was a labyrinth of over 20,000 precision-cut gears, gyroscopes, and humming servomotors. Deep within the armored citadel of a battleship, technicians like Chief Petty Officer Henry Miller, a former watchmaker from Massachusetts, would spend up to 100 hours calibrating the machine. The air in the computer room was thick, with the smell of lubricating oil and ozone, the scent of a machine that could predict a target's future position with an accuracy of less than 2 milliradians. Paragraph 6/10 Expansion. The secret weapon saw its first taste of combat on January 5, 1943. Near Guadalcanal, the light cruiser USS Celina, CL-50, commanded by Captain Charles P. Cecil, received authorization to use the new shells. When a lone Japanese Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber appeared, the Kalina's 5-inch guns roared. The very first VT-fuzzed shell fired in anger detonated as it neared the plane, which simply disintegrated in a flash of orange and black smoke against the blue Pacific sky. The gun crew was stunned. The secret was now a proven killer. Paragraph 7/10 Impact. The security protocols surrounding the fascia were draconian. The Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive of January 15, 1943, was unequivocal. The fuse was forbidden from being used over land, where a dud could be captured. Admiral Blandy enforced this with religious zeal. He created a new role, the Special Ordnance Officer. Men like Lieutenant John M. Sterling, a young MIT graduate, were assigned to every task force carrying the weapon. Their only duty was to supervise the handling of the, quote, Mark 32 special fuses, ensuring they were only installed into shells minutes before firing. The fuses arrived at the fleet in nondescript green crates, their true nature known to only 2 men on each ship, the captain and the gunnery officer. Paragraph 8/10 Development. This secret weapon required a new kind of warship, and the old battleships were its chosen vessel. Throughout 1944, ships like the U.S. Tennessee, BB-43, were cycled through the Puget Sound Navy Yard, where Captain Charles D. Wheelock presided over their $12 million transformation. The old cage masts were cut away, replaced by new superstructures bristling with the 15-foot wide antenna of the SK-2 air search radar. Over 25 miles of new armored electrical cable snaked through the ship's bulkheads, connecting the radar plot to the new CIC and the Mark I computer below. Her old, ineffective 5-inch/25 caliber guns were ripped out and replaced with 16 new dual-purpose 5-inch/38 caliber guns in 8 heavily armored twin mounts. The dry dock air was a constant cacophony of riveting hammers and the hiss of welding torches, the sounds of rebirth. Paragraph 9/10 Expansion. By the close of 1944, the 4-year secret was fully deployed. Dr. Vannevar Bush reviewed the final summary, OSRD Document 88T45, in his Washington office. The project had cost over $1 billion and produced more than 22 million fuzzes. Fewer than 1,000 men in the entire Allied war effort knew the full truth. In the magazines of the 10 old battleships of Task Force 51, thousands of shells now sat waiting, each tipped with its own tiny radar set. An invisible, impenetrable umbrella of steel was about to be unfurled over the Pacific. Paragraph 10/10 Impact. In the photo analysis section of the Imperial Japanese Navy's General Staff in Tokyo, Captain Sadatoshi Tomioka leaned over a damp reconnaissance photograph taken on March 21, 1945. The air smelled of developing chemicals and stale green tea. The image showed the American fleet massing at Ulithi Atoll. Tomioka, a meticulous officer from a long line of samurai, noted the strange new antennas atop the old battleships, like the U.S. Tennessee, BB-43. He dismissed them in his report, dated March 23, as upgraded radio equipment. This single fatal assumption, shared by his superior Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, was the cornerstone of their ignorance. Paragraph 1/15 Impact. At Kanoya Air Base in Kyushu, Lieutenant Commander Goro Nonake, a veteran pilot with over 800 flight hours, briefed the 45 young men of the 201st Air Group on April 5, 1945. He was a stern man, his face weathered from years in open cockpits, who chain-smoked Hope cigarettes down to the nub. He pointed with a bamboo stick to a silhouette of a U.S. Standard-type battleship on the chalkboard. He told his pilots, most of whom had fewer than 150 hours of flight time, to expect a dense but predictable curtain of fire from the ship's numerous 40mm Bofors guns. Their intelligence, based on reports from late 1944, made no mention of any new capability for the larger 5-inch guns, which they were told to fly under. The air in the unpainted wooden hut was thick with cigarette smoke and the quiet, nervous energy of men preparing to die. Paragraph 215's development. Aboard the U.S. Maryland BB-46, Lieutenant Commander Joseph T. Hayward, the ship's intense 32-year-old gunnery officer, ran a final systems check on April 5, 1945, at 2,200 hours. A 1935 Naval Academy graduate, Hayward had a nervous habit of constantly adjusting the green celluloid eye shade he wore in the Combat Information Center. The air in the CIC was kept a chilly 68 degrees Fahrenheit, smelling faintly of ozone from the glowing radar scopes. He watched as two of his best operators, Petty Officer Bill Jensen and Seaman Frank Miller, tracked a simulated flight of 12 inbound bogies on the SK-2 radar display. Below decks, the 3 100-pound Mark I computer hummed, its servo motors whirring as it calculated a firing solution in just under 14 seconds. Hayward didn't know the full secret of the shells, only that his new system was uncannily, terrifyingly effective. Paragraph 315's expansion. The first wave of the Kikusui No. 1 attack began at 1400 on April 6, 1945. At a listening post in Kyushu, Warrant Officer Kenji Tanaka clamped his headphones tight, the Bakelite pressing into his ears. The transmissions from the pilots were clear at first, then descended into chaos. He heard a pilot from the 66 Sentai scream, "They explode before they reach us. The sky is tearing itself apart." Tanaka logged the time, 14:28, as he heard at least 3 separate pilots report their wingmen disintegrating for no reason. Within 25 minutes, over 40 aircraft from the first wave went silent. Paragraph 415's impact. On the flag bridge of the U.S. Tennessee, BB-43, Captain Andrew D.S. Mack, a stoic veteran of the Murmansk Run, watched the attack unfold through his 7x50 binoculars. The sky was pockmarked with hundreds of black puffs of smoke from the VT Fuzed shells, each one a 70-foot sphere of lethal shrapnel. The ship's 16 5-inch/38 caliber guns fired in a steady rhythmic salvo, a sound like a colossal mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through the steel deck plates. He saw a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, still a good one, 500 yards out, simply come apart in midair, its wing shearing off as it flew into one of those invisible kill zones. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burnt cordite. Paragraph 515's development. Back in Kyushu, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, the grim commander of the 5th Air Fleet, tried to make sense of the carnage. The after-action reports from the few surviving pilots of the April 6th attack were baffling. They spoke of ghost shells and invisible walls of steel. His intelligence officer, Commander Tadashi Nakajima, a graduate of the Naval War College, theorized that the Americans must have developed a new, hyper-accurate optical rangefinder. Of the 355 kamikaze and conventional aircraft sent out that day, their initial assessment showed a catastrophic loss rate of over 70% before reaching the primary targets. Ugaki, a methodical man who kept a detailed personal diary, made a note on April 7, 1945, blaming the failure on the poor spirit of the new pilots, a complete misreading of the technological slaughter that had just occurred. Paragraph 615's expansion. Deep in the magazine of the U.S. Idaho BB-42, Lieutenant John M. Sterling, a 24-year-old MIT physics graduate serving as the ship's special ordnance officer, performed his sole critical duty. He was a quiet, bookish man with thick glasses, an unlikely warrior whose battlefield was a checklist. He supervised 2 sailors as they carefully uncrated the Mark 32 fuzzes from their sealed green wooden boxes. The air was cool and smelled of fresh paint and hydraulic fluid. With a specialized wrench, they screwed the 2-pound fuzzes onto the noses of the 55-pound high-capacity shells, a process that took exactly 45 seconds per round. His orders were absolute. No fuse was to be installed more than 30 minutes before it was expected to be fired. Paragraph 7/15. Impact. The psychological impact on the Japanese pilots was profound. On April 12, 1945, a 19-year-old pilot, Sub-Lieutenant Kenjiro Tanaka, was debriefed at Kanoya Air Base after aborting his mission. His hands trembled as he recounted seeing the 2 Zeros in his element simply fly into black puffs of smoke and vanish, hundreds of yards from the nearest American battleship. He had seen no tracers, heard no hits. His commanding officer, Captain Motoharu Okamura, a hard-bitten veteran, dismissed the story as cowardice and combat shock. Tanaka was grounded and reassigned to maintenance duties. His eyewitness account of the magic fuzz buried under layers of military pride and disbelief. Paragraph 8/15. Development. The operation of the American system was a seamless fusion of technology and training. On the USS West Virginia, BB-48, the entire process from initial detection to destruction took an average of 38 seconds. A target identified by the SK-2 radar at 90 miles was plotted by a team of 12 sailors in the CIC under Lieutenant Commander Marcus Peabody, a former high school math teacher from Ohio. At 25,000 yards, the target data was electrically transmitted to the Mark 37 director. Inside the director, Seaman Ray Kowalski, a 20-year-old from Chicago, would confirm the target visually, but the Mark I computer deep in the ship's armored citadel was already tracking it, its 20,000 gears and servos whirring as it calculated a continuous, predictive firing solution. The gun captain, Chief Gunner McGraw, a barrel-chested man with a tattoo of a 5-inch shell on his forearm, simply waited for the solution-ready light to glow green before squeezing the firing trigger. Paragraph 9/15. Expansion. In Tokyo, a new intelligence summary reached the desk of Admiral Suemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, on April 28, 1945. The report, compiled by Commander Sadatoshi Tomioka's team, concluded that the high Kamikaze losses were due to the massive increase in the number of 40 mm Bofors and 20 mm Oerlikon guns. They focused on what they could count, the gun barrels. The report recommended that pilots adopt a steeper, faster dive profile to pass through the small-caliber flak zone as quickly as possible. This tactical change would, tragically, make them even better targets for the long-range, computer-aimed 5-inch guns with their VT fuzzes. Paragraph 10/15. Impact. Even the men at the heart of the system were kept in the dark. Chief Petty Officer Henry Miller, the former watchmaker responsible for maintaining the Mark I computer on the U.S. Pennsylvania BB-38, worked in a cramped, noisy compartment deep in the ship. The air always smelled of warm lubricant and ozone. He knew every one of its 20,000 gears, could diagnose a faulty servomotor by its hum. He was told his 100-pound machine helped the gunners aim better, but he had no idea about the secret in the shell's nose. When he heard reports of entire squadrons being wiped out, he'd just pat the warm metal casing of his machine and think the gun crews were having an exceptionally good day. Paragraph 11/15. Development. The depth of the Japanese misunderstanding was staggering. On May 11, 1945, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, a carrier man to his corps, launched Kikusui No. 6, an attack of over 150 aircraft. American radio intelligence at FRUPAC, under the command of Captain Joseph Rochefort, intercepted the Japanese communications. They listened as squadron leaders explicitly ordered their pilots to bypass the slow battleships, derisively called the Iron Pigs, and strike the high-value carriers of Task Force 58. This order, based on the fatally flawed assumption that the battleships were only a threat to surface ships, sent hundreds of pilots flying directly into the most concentrated and technologically advanced anti-aircraft screen ever assembled. The intercept log for that day reads like a testament to a foe flying blind into a buzzsaw. Paragraph 12/15. Expansion. The result was a massacre. On May 12, the U.S. New Mexico, BB-40, was attacked by two kamikazes. The first was obliterated by a 5-inch shell at 2,000 yards. The second was torn apart by the combined fire of the 40mm and 20mm guns. All around Task Force 51, the sky was a lethal canvas of black puffs and flaming debris. The vulnerable transports and escort carriers, the true objective of the attack, were almost completely shielded. The secret weapon wasn't just working. It was systematically dismantling Japan's last desperate offensive. Paragraph 13/15. Impact. The last, faint glimmer of a warning came not from the Pacific, but from Europe. The Japanese naval attaché in Berlin, Vice Admiral Hideo Kojima, was briefed in February 1945 by German intelligence on rumors of an Allied radio fuse being used against V-1 flying bombs. The German report, based on research by Dr. Friedrich von Schack at Rheinmetall Borsig, was highly speculative. Kojima's summary, transmitted to Tokyo via a U-boat courier in March 1945, was filled with technical jargon and arrived when the empire was already collapsing. It was filed away by a junior officer in the Naval General Staff, its potential significance completely unrecognized. Paragraph 14/15 development. And so, the war steamed towards its conclusion with the two navies operating in different technological realities. As American gunnery officers like Joseph T. Hayward watched their systems perform with godlike efficiency, Japanese commanders like Matome Ugaki continued to send their young pilots out with exhortations of spiritual strength. The pilots, in turn, flew their bomb-laden Zeros toward what they believed was a wall of conventional flak, never knowing they were entering an invisible, overlapping network of 70-foot-wide kill zones created by a weapon they couldn't conceive of. The steel umbrella held, its integrity guaranteed not only by the genius of its creators, but by the profound and unshakable ignorance of its targets. Paragraph 15/15 expansion. The sheer scale of the Okinawa campaign, which began on April 1, 1945, represented the ultimate test for the steel umbrella. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, and Vice Admiral Richmond K. Turner, leading the 300-ship amphibious force, knew they were sailing into the teeth of Japan's final desperate gamble. The air over the Ryukyu Islands was thick, not just with humidity, but with a palpable tension, the metallic scent of a fleet bracing for an onslaught of over 900 kamikaze aircraft. The fate of 183,000 landing troops rested on the performance of a secret weapon those men didn't even know existed. The first massive Kikusui attack on April 6, 1945, was a storm of steel and fanaticism. From the bridge of the U.S. Tennessee, BB-43, Captain Andrew D.S. Mack watched as his ship's 16 5-inch guns began their methodical, deafening rhythm. The sky, once blue, was rapidly filled with hundreds of black puffs, each one a 70-foot sphere of lethal shrapnel from a VT-fused shell. The ship's Mark I computer, humming deep within its armored core, was calculating firing solutions for a dozen targets simultaneously. That day alone, the Battleship Screening Force, under Rear Admiral Morton L. Deo, was credited with downing over 150 enemy aircraft, a staggering 75% of which were attributed to the 5-inch guns. For the Japanese pilots, the experience was incomprehensible. The air itself seemed to be exploding around them, tearing their planes apart long before they could see their targets. The stench of burnt cordite was the smell of a technological slaughter. In his command bunker at Kanoya Air Base, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki was consumed by a frustrated rage. The initial reports from the few surviving pilots of the April 6th attack were a confusing mess of panicked talk about ghost shells and invisible defenses. His intelligence officer, Commander Tadashi Nakajima, a graduate of the Naval War College, pored over the accounts for over 18 hours straight, the air in the concrete room thick with the smoke from his Hope cigarettes. Lacking any framework for a proximity fuse, Nakajima's final report, dated April 8, 1945, concluded the high losses were due to the Americans' overwhelming number of 40 mm Bofors guns. This fatal miscalculation led Ugaki to order pilots to adopt even steeper, faster dive profiles, a tactic that only made them better, more predictable targets for the long-range computer-aimed guns of the steel umbrella. He was, in effect, ordering his men to fly faster into a buzzsaw. On the U.S. Maryland BB-46, the Combat Information Center was an oasis of cool, quiet lethality. Lieutenant Commander Joseph T. Hayward, his green eye shade pulled low against the glare of the scopes, watched a single blip, a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy, detach from a larger group at 22,000 yards. The entire process took just 37 seconds. The SK-2 radar fed its data to the whirring Mark I computer, which sent a firing solution to the Mark 37 director. At 500 yards, the ship's guns fired a single 4-round salvo. Hayward watched the blip on the screen simply vanish, replaced by a momentary burst of static. The low hum of the ship's electronics was the only sound accompanying the enemy's silent, instantaneous death. Back in Maryland, the war hadn't stopped for the scientists of Section T. Dr. Merle A. Tuve, driven by the initial combat reports relayed by Admiral Blandy, was already pushing his team to refine the fuse's design. By May 1945, they had developed the improved Mark 45 fuse, which used a more rugged pentode vacuum tube, the Sylvania 1S5, increasing its sensitivity by nearly 15% against the smaller, faster Japanese aircraft. Dr. Vannevar Bush personally authorized an emergency production run of 200,000 of these new fuzzes at the Crosley Corporation plant in Cincinnati, Ohio. This constant secret evolution ensured that even as the enemy adapted their tactics, the American technological advantage was not just maintained, but actively sharpened, a cycle of innovation completely invisible to the Japanese high command. The impact was measured in steel saved and lives preserved. While the kamikazes did draw blood, the destroyer U.S. Laffey, DD-724, famously survived 6 kamikaze hits and 4 bomb impacts on April 16, 1945. The steel umbrella prevented a catastrophe. Of the 900 suicide sorties flown at Okinawa, only a fraction reached the main transport fleet. The system directly enabled the successful landing of General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr.'s entire 10th Army of 183,000 men. Post-war analysis by the Bureau of Ordnance estimated that the VT fuse saved the fleet from at least 500 more successful hits, potentially preserving over 150 ships and saving the lives of more than 20,000 sailors. The metallic tang of blood in the water was far less than it would have been, a testament to the invisible shield. As their conventional attacks failed, the Japanese unleashed their most terrifying weapon, the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, a rocket-powered, human-guided flying bomb. On April 12, 1945, an Oka slammed into the destroyer USS Manert El Abele, DD-733, at over 600 miles per hour, breaking the ship in two and killing 84 of her crew. The sheer velocity of this new threat, which left no time for human gunners to react, presented the ultimate challenge to the automated defense system. The steel umbrella adapted. The key was not to target the Oka itself, but the slow, vulnerable Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bomber that carried it to within 20 miles of the fleet. Gunnery officers like Joseph T. Hayward retrained their CIC teams, and technicians like Chief Henry Miller recalibrated their Mark I computers to prioritize these lumbering motherships. The SK-2 radar could spot a Betty from over 80 miles out, giving the system ample time to track, target, and destroy it. On May 11, 1945, the U.S. New Mexico BB-40 demonstrated this new doctrine perfectly, obliterating a Betty, carrying an Oka at a range of over 12,000 yards, long before it had a chance to launch its deadly payload. As the weapon's strategic importance became undeniable, the security protocols reached a fever pitch. On every battleship, a special ordnance officer like Lieutenant John M. Sterling conducted a mandatory, twice-daily physical inventory of the Mark 32 fuzzes, his breath misting in the cool 60-degree air of the forward magazine. Each green crate was sealed with a lead wire stamp, the number of which was logged and transmitted via encrypted teletype to Admiral Blandy's office in Washington. Blandy himself reviewed these logs every morning at 0700, the smell of his strong coffee mixing with the scent of fresh ink from the printers. The secret of the fuzz was now considered a national treasure, a war-winning advantage, whose compromise, Admiral Spruance noted in a May 1945 dispatch, would be more damaging than the loss of a carrier. By the time the bloody 82-day battle for Okinawa concluded on June 22, 1945, the verdict was in. The steel umbrella had been tested by the most intense aerial suicide campaign in history and had not broken. Japan's Divine Wind, their last, best hope to stave off defeat, had been technologically defeated by a weapon they never understood. Vice Admiral Turner's massive invasion fleet was intact, and the sea lanes to Japan lay open. The victory was absolute, written in the thousands of black puffs of smoke that had haunted the skies over the Ryukyus, the silent, deadly signature of a perfectly kept secret. July 19, 1978, 2:45 p.m., National Archives, College Park, Maryland. The air, thick with the scent of aging paper and binding glue, hung still in the silent research room. Dr. Alistair Finch, a naval historian with a penchant for declassified ordnance reports, carefully untied the faded red ribbon on a file box labeled OSRD Document 88T45. His fingers, stained with ink from his morning's work, gently lifted the cover. Inside lay the, quote, final report on the Proximity Fuze development program, a document kept under lock and key for over 30 years. For decades, the story of the Pacific War's end seemed settled. Finch was about to learn that history had been missing its most decisive chapter. Paragraph 1/10. Impact. As Dr. Alistair Finch read, the quiet hum of the archive's ventilation system faded into a distant buzz. The brittle, yellowed pages of OSRD Document 88T45 laid bare a secret of unimaginable scale. The numbers were staggering. Over 22 million Mark 32 VT fuzzes produced by 87 different contractors at a cost exceeding $1 billion by August 1945. He saw the names of the architects, Dr. Vannevar Bush and Dr. Merle A. Tuve, whose signatures were on the authorization forms. The technical specifications described a complete 5-vacuum tube Doppler radar transceiver, small enough to fit in the nose of a 5-inch shell, yet rugged enough to withstand 20,000 gigaseconds of force. It wasn't just a new shell, it was a thinking bullet, and according to this report, it had been the decisive factor in defeating the Kamikaze. Paragraph 2/10 development. The document's very existence in his hands was a bureaucratic miracle, classified top secret, eyes only. Since its final entry on August 10, 1945, the report had been buried for 33 years. It was only due to the slow, methodical churn of President Richard Nixon's Executive Order 11652 from 1972, which mandated the automatic declassification of millions of wartime documents, that it had surfaced at all. A small team of just 12 archivists at the National Declassification Center, under the direction of Dr. Edwin C. Thompson, had processed this file box just 2 weeks prior. For them, it was one of thousands of mundane declassifications. For Finch, holding the cool, dry paper, the revelation felt like a physical shock, a historical earthquake that was about to topple decades of accepted military scholarship about the Pacific War's final bloody year. Paragraph 3/10 expansion. Suddenly, everything clicked into place for Dr. Finch. The impossibly high Japanese aircraft losses at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It wasn't just superior American pilots. The near-total failure of the 1-900 Kamikaze sorties at Okinawa, it wasn't just poor Japanese training. It was this. He immediately placed a call to the eminent, 91-year-old naval historian, Professor Samuel Eliot Morison. Over the crackling phone line, Finch read key passages. Morison, a man who had personally served on 11 ships during the war, was left momentarily speechless, admitting he'd heard whispers of a funny fuse, but never understood its systemic, war-altering impact. Paragraph 4, tense impact. Working with a feverish intensity fueled by black coffee and the scent of old books, Dr. Alistair Finch collaborated with the U.S. Naval Institute. In the fall of 1979, his groundbreaking article, The Umbrella of TF-51, was published in their influential Proceedings magazine. The 12-page spread was dense with newly unearthed facts, detailing how the Ford Mark I fire control computer, with its 20,000 intricate parts, was the brain that connected the SK-2 radar's eyes to the VT Fuze's claws. He cited the after-action report of the U.S. Tennessee, BB-43, from April 6, 1945, which documented the expenditure of just 1.885-inch rounds to down 12 enemy aircraft, a kill-to-round ratio of 15.6, a number so efficient it had previously been dismissed by historians as a typo or an exaggeration. Paragraph 5, 10th development. The story exploded into the public consciousness with the 1983 publication of The Invisible Shield, The War's Second Secret, a best-selling book by veteran New York Times science journalist Walter Sullivan. Sullivan tracked down surviving members of Section T, including a retired Dr. James Van Allen, the physicist who later discovered the Van Allen radiation belts. In his Iowa home, smelling of pipe tobacco and old leather, Van Allen finally described the 16-hour days and constant failures at the 8621 Georgia Avenue lab, the floor littered with the glass shards of over 1,500 failed tube prototypes. Sullivan also interviewed former gunnery officer Joseph T. Hayward, who, at 70 years old, recounted his awe at watching entire Japanese squadrons evaporate into black puffs of smoke a mile away. For 38 years, Hayward had believed his crews were simply the best in the fleet. Now he knew they had been wielding a weapon that bordered on science fiction. Paragraph 6/10, expansion. At a 1984 reunion for the crew of the U.S. Maryland, BB-46, in a stuffy San Diego hotel ballroom, the air thick with the smell of catered food and old memories, a former fire controlman named Ray Kowalski read a passage from Sullivan's book aloud. A hush fell over the 200 aging veterans in the room. For the first time, these men, mechanics, gunners, lookouts, understood the true nature of the invisible shield they had operated. They finally knew why their ship, which had absorbed 2 direct kamikaze hits, had survived 82 days of hell off Okinawa. They had been guardians of the war's most decisive secret without ever knowing it. Paragraph 7/10, impact. The historical record began its slow, grinding correction. By 1987, new editions of seminal World War II histories, including Dr. Stephen E. Ambrose's popular works, started incorporating the story of the VT Fuze. The official history of the Bureau of Ordnance, once a dry account of logistics, was re-examined by scholars like Dr. Norman Friedman, who now saw it as the story of a technological revolution. The narrative that the battleship became obsolete after Pearl Harbor was shattered. The work of Dr. Alistair Finch and Walter Sullivan had transformed a historical footnote into a main chapter, proving that the old dreadnoughts, far from being useless, had been repurposed into the most vital defensive asset of the entire Allied invasion fleet. Paragraph 8/10, development. The revelation echoed across the Pacific. In October 1988, the Japan National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo hosted a symposium to discuss the new findings. A translated copy of Walter Sullivan's book was the central topic. In the audience sat Commander Hachiro Hoshino, a former junior staff officer to Captain Sadatoshi Tomioka. The air in the formal wood-paneled room was thick, with the scent of green tea and the heavier weight of a 43-year-old mystery being solved. For decades, Hoshino and his colleagues had attributed the Kamikaze failures to declining pilot skill and morale. Now, faced with schematics of the Mark 32 Fuze's Doppler radar, they understood. They had sent their young men, armed with spiritual devotion, against a semi-autonomous computer-driven killing machine. Their silence was a profound admission. They had been defeated by a technology they couldn't even have conceived of. Paragraph 9/10, Expansion. The story of the steel umbrella was no longer a secret, but a legend. It became a core case study at military academies from West Point to the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, the textbook example of the birth of modern, networked, systems warfare. It was the direct, technological ancestor of all modern naval air defense systems, from the Cold War's Terrier missile systems to the Aegis combat system deployed on destroyers today. The arrogant dismissal of the old battleships by Japanese intelligence was now taught as a cautionary tale. The most decisive weapon isn't always the one you can see, and the course of history can be changed by a secret hidden in plain sight. The truth was finally, irrevocably, out. Paragraph 10 out of 10 Impact. The recognition, when it finally came, was decades overdue but deeply resonant. On October 27, 1990, in a crisp autumn ceremony at the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, the U.S. Navy posthumously awarded the Distinguished Public Service Medal to 12 key civilian scientists from Section T. Dr. Merle A. Tuve's daughter accepted the award for her father, the citation specifically honoring his team's work on the ruggedized T3 vacuum tube. The air, smelling of polished brass and floor wax, was punctuated by the sharp crack of a 21-gun salute that echoed across the Potomac, a final, thunderous acknowledgment for the 400 men whose genius had remained a state secret for nearly half a century. The story of the steel umbrella forced a fundamental rewriting of the Pacific War's final chapter. Historians like Dr. Alistair Finch, once a lone voice, now led a scholarly revolution. By 1992, at the 18th International Congress of the History of Science in Hamburg, Germany, the central theme was Systems of War, with the integrated defense of Task Force 51 as the prime example. The old narrative, championed by scholars like Samuel Eliot Morison, that battleships were obsolete giants, was replaced by a more nuanced truth. They had been reborn. Today, visitors walking the preserved teak decks of the museum ship USS North Carolina, BB-55, can stand beside a 5-inch gun mount and understand that this wasn't just a gun. It was the claw of a complex machine, a system whose 100-pound analog brain saved an estimated 20,000 American lives. This revelation's greatest legacy wasn't just historical, it was foundational to all modern naval doctrine. The core concept of systems warfare, the seamless integration of a sensor, a computer, and a weapon, pioneered by Dr. Vannevar Bush's OSRD, became the guiding principle of post-war naval development. It led directly to the RIM-2 Terrier missile program in 1951 and culminated in the Aegis combat system, first deployed in 1983. A modern chief of naval operations like Admiral Mike Gilday can trace the lineage of his fleet's defense directly back to that converted garage in Silver Spring. The low, powerful hum of the CIC aboard a modern Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, its SPY-1 radar tracking over 100 targets simultaneously, is the direct technological descendant of the whirring gears in the Mark I computer and the 5 tiny vacuum tubes that made the Kamikaze obsolete. It was a lesson in steel and silicon that the Navy never forgot. For the men who operated the system, the truth brought a quiet, profound vindication. At a 2000 reunion of Section T's surviving members, only 34 of the original 400 scientists and engineers drive. James Van Allen, then 86, spoke of the immense pride in knowing their work had been so decisive. At the National Museum of the U.S. Navy in Washington, D.C., Exhibit 308 now features a cutaway of the Mark 32 Fuze. Veterans of Okinawa, now great-grandfathers, would bring their families, their hands trembling slightly as they touched the cool glass of the display case. They'd point to the 5 tiny tubes inside and finally explain the real reason they came home, their voices thick with the emotion of a secret carried for a lifetime, a story they could at last fully tell. Years later, in the quiet, climate-controlled halls of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, a single inert Mark 32 Proximity Fuze sits under a solitary spotlight. It's small, unassuming, just a 2-pound piece of metal and glass, but within its simple shell lies the weight of history, the genius of Dr. Vannevar Bush and Dr. Merle Tuve, the logistical might of Admiral Blandy, the lives of 20,000 sailors, and the silent, decisive defeat of an enemy who never knew what hit them. It's the physical embodiment of the war's greatest technological secret, a thinking bullet that shielded a fleet, saved an invasion, and for over 30 years held its peace.